Good afternoon. So we started the lunch much later than anticipated, but we have the social event at 5, so I guess we're all highly motivated to finish on time. So welcome to one of the first sessions, breakout sessions. We still have an open seat. We hope Amaro Gomez will fill it. So my name is Henri Fortin. I'm from the World Bank. I've been involved in those issues of accounting and auditing standards for quite a while here in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also at an international level. So a little over 10 years ago now, we had the global financial crisis. And following the global financial crisis, we witnessed a process whereby the standard setters decided to revisit the standards. In a way, one of the lessons of the crisis is that some of the standards did not fully pass the test of a real-life crisis. And we'll hear about those in a while. So 10 years later, we are going to try to take stock with the little time we have. And tomorrow there's going to be another session, which I'm sure will touch also on those issues, on what has been done to those standards, a little over 10 years. So we'll hear from the standard setter for the International Accounting Standards Board. But also we'll hear from the practitioners. So I'm going to introduce the three panelists that are here with us today. From the practitioners both in terms of preparers, in terms of auditors, but also in terms of regulators, because that's the form of practice. All of which are concerned with the quality of the standards and have to apply or enforce or teach those standards. Again, I'm referring to the International Accounting Standards, International Financial Reporting Standards, but also the International Standards on Auditing and the Ethics Code, which is attached to it. So today we have four panelists. Their bios, I'm told, are published on the website, but I'll, as a courtesy, I'll briefly introduce them. Immediately to my left, we have Mr. Alfredo Rodriguez Neira. Alfredo is a good friend of, I think he was at the first Crecer with us. He's the CEO of a consulting firm out of Panama, which specializes in accounting and auditing standards. He's also a professor at the Catholic University of Lima. He's an expert in international standards, both in the public sector and the private sector. To Alfredo's left, we have Jorge Cano, who is a partner with BDO. Are we okay with the translation, by the way? Okay. Nobody's translating? Yes? Sorry. So Jorge has been for 21 years in the practice. He specializes in BDO in financial services, banks, and so on. He's the lead partner in that practice. He's from Panama, from the Panama office. He used to be the president of the professional accountancy organization, the leading one, the Colegio, I assume? Yes, because I know there's various. And he was also something that's really interesting I discovered when I went to Panama. It's the Universidad Especializada de los Contadores Públicos, the specialized university of CPA, which is managed in a way by the Colegio, by the profession. He is a CPA by trade and has a master's in business administration. To Jorge's left, we have Mr. Rodrigo Segura Cano, who is the Director of Supervision for Issuers and Investment Fund here in Costa Rica. He's with the Superintendency of Securities, the Securities Market Regulator. He has a background in business administration. He was trained here at the famous university INCAE here in Costa Rica. And to Rodrigo's left, we have Amaro Gomez. Welcome, Amaro. Amaro is one of the board members of the International Accounting Standards Board since 2009. I understand he will move to a new job in a few weeks after 10 years. When Amaro and I met, he was at the Central Bank of Brazil, where he was in charge of the regulation of the financial systems. He also, in this capacity, the Central Bank of Brazil, he was involved in all the process of adoption of IFRS in Brazil, and also with the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision in, all the contribution of the banking supervisors community to international standard setting. So, 10 years later, what can we say about the key changes? And obviously, we have about an hour to do that, so obviously it's not fully giving justice to the topic, but so, Amaro, even though you came the last week, you're going to be the first to start, as agreed. Since who better than ISB can tell us what happened to those standards, this sort of IFRS 2.0, that's how I like to call them. Maybe it's not an official designation. So, in a nutshell, and time is of the essence, and again, we have the hard deadline of 5:20, but we also have to get changed for that. So, Amaro, in about 5 minutes, can you give us an overview of all those many changes in the last 10 years? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon.
And very interesting at this point, I was part of the central bank, not only in regulations, we also supported what happened in the world as far as crisis management. And in the discussions, what we would hear the most in the regulation was, I will only mention this in 5 minutes, I have what I heard related to international accounting. And what we would hear was three main things. The first one, that recognition of or the measurement of assets of the market securities was one of the culprits of this crisis. And the second issue was the regulation we had for financial instruments, that IASI had for financial instruments, was very complex, hard to apply, hard to understand also by the users in general terms. And the third point is that one of the main components of this regulation was related to the effect in loans or damage, and which took into account only occurred events. Therefore, the damage recognized was little and too late. So, because of an interesting fact, I was part of the Brazil team that worked with the crisis management in G20, and in July 2009, I went to IASP, and one of the the idea there was to hire Latin America with experience in this to share the experience of regulators in the discussions of IASP at that moment as an answer to crises. And what answer was there? Well, G20, the Financial Stability Institute, that back then was a board, the board, recommended that IASP to review its regulations related to financial instruments, specifically paying attention to provisioning on a loss, and to work with the U.S. to develop accounting rules that would be adopted internationally as one of the measures to repair the financial situation in the markets. Therefore, IASB had a working plan back then, which must immediately respond to the crisis. That was the main response to the crisis by IASB was to establish NIC 39, which was a financial instrument which reviewed the classification and measurement of financial assets by the end of 2009. And then the classification and measurement of financial liabilities with total coverage. Until then, in 2014, we're able to complete this review. It was the first time in the ISB history where there was a statement produced. But in 2014, we started creating NIC 39, much before the crisis. But in 2009, we made additional efforts. So in 2014, only in 2014, we were able to complete this review with the requirement to review loss, expected loss. And so it was based on principles for the loss of assets, and that was expanded for financial assets in general terms according to the NIC 9 assessment. And these assets should be provisioned from its acknowledgement, completely different to what we have under NIC 39. Therefore, a significant effect in financial aspects in all those entities, not only financial, but also non-financial entities were affected if they use NIC. And for this reason, now we have a provision that from the first day considers a loss for the following 12 months, but if there's a damage in credit risk, the operation, immediately it considers the damage. And we weren't able to agree with the U.S. on a unique accounting provision. So the world would identify, starting next year, when the U.S. accounting standard will be comparing the EASP requirements, which adoption was January 1st, 2019, and it will be compared to the adoption of the U.S. GAAP. And the main difference is that for EASP, the first day, the impairment considers the next 12 months, and the U.S. considers the first day the life cycle of the loan. So if it's a mortgage loan for 15 years, in the EASP, it considers a possibility of a loss in 12 months, but in the U.S. for 50 years. So the provisioning is very intense. There's a very great difference. And there's also an effect on capital requirement, which is one of the most important points for bank regulators. So, and NIC 9 was a main answer to the crisis, recommendation by G20, and it's recognized today as a proper recognition to the 2007-2008 crisis as far as loan portfolios and as far as classification and measurement of financial assets and liabilities. Thank you, Amaro. Those who have to apply these standards are the companies, and we don't have a company here today, but those who are very concerned about standards, and I'll speak in Spanish now, are the auditors, the accounting standards as well as the audit standards. So Jorge, you have a dual task of explaining from your profession, auditor's profession, how do you see changes in coming years? And what is our current condition, if there are any challenges, and specifically the auditor's statement. After 10 years of the financial crisis, standards have changed greatly in the world. And what this has created is greater and more transparency in the information in risk management of financial instruments, much better management of financial instruments, and it's been difficult. I'm from Panama. And we, with the regulator, auditors have been in constant communication much before the effective date, which was into 2018, when the financial statements are under NIF 9, which has been the standard that has caused great headaches to the entities and more to regulated entities and the entities that are part of the stock market. We did carry this out with the regulator, and in 2016 they produced an agreement where the banks had to produce a model of expected loss. In the past it was incurred loss, and they started preparing 1 year before the standard effective date. In January 2018 they had to start running the model, and this was a good experience, and because as Hispanics do, we leave everything for last, but banks were already ready starting in January 1st, 2018, with the models validated by the superintendency and also validated because we were working hand in hand with the regulated entity, looking at the models that were being used and in the model to determine expected loss. It was an impact where the boards were informed, the boards of the entities, they were informed to be prepared because they might require capital depending on their reserve. They were very concerned, but at the end of the day, since the regulator demanded financial statements under international standards, they had to comply. So it wasn't as traumatic the first year, because since 2016 they were already implementing their model parallel to the NIC 39 had been using through 2017. So in 2017 they stopped with NIC 39, and starting January 1st they started using NIF 9. So for non-regulated companies, family companies, it's been a little traumatic because they're not used to a reserve based on an investment or portfolio where you don't foresee incurred loss. And they would say, well, if it's short term, I have no problem. But the standard forced a assessment to have a provision. So there we had a lot of issues as far as the this affected judgment. This affected the companies that were listed. It included the new opinion model, which included the ongoing business diagnosis, as well as important aspects in the audit. So these entities had to include this, listed companies had to include the new part of the opinion. But there was an absence here. The important thing is to teach. We did teach. We started telling them it's going to be in 2 years, so you have to teach the company, the clients, the regulators also teach for the companies to prepare, not leave everything for last, and to inform that the capital has to be audited and it has to be according to a diagnosis for provision. In banks, it was important. Since 2016, they were carrying out both scenarios, and we had to send, as auditors, we had to send a certification showing them what was the effect between the two reserves that were being managed, 39, which was being used at that moment, because they wanted to know what was going to be the impact of the financial health of the banks. So they wanted to know how much capital adequacy they had to have if they were under the capital adequacy. And it was done. And as I said, there's a lot of teaching and not leave it to the year of implementation of any standard. And this is for the companies to prepare, and as far as management and at corporate government or board, because they are the decision makers at the end, for them to see what impact they can have to perform studies prior to the implementation of the standard, to take all the provisions for that new fiscal year, if they have to capitalize, if they have to, so they can make the decision. But it's very important to train before any standard. That's been my experience, and it has worked. And I think from now on in Panama, everything's going to be done much time ahead before any new standard. Thank you very much, Jorge. Then I have a question for you later on. But now let's speak with Ricardo. What's a regulator's perspective? Because the regulator currently has to ensure the sectors in which they have responsibilities that the standards are being complied, either accounting or audit. Since you regulate pension funds, investment funds, and standard issuers, how do you see these regulatory changes in these last 10 years? What are your views from Costa Rica? I know you discussed this with your Latin American colleagues in Austria. So which are the most important points you would like to highlight regarding these changes? Yes, I'll be happy to. Just to give you a bit of a context, our financial system, Costa Rica has a National Supervisors Council of the Supervisors that has four superintendents, and most Latin American countries have something similar. A bank superintendent, a security superintendent, pension superintendent, and one specialized in insurance. And just to share our experience the last 10 years, as what happened in the financial information standards, also the international principles in different sectors, banks, securities, pensions, insurance, suffered great changes after this crisis, especially in accounting and accounting, especially in IOSCO, that issues for securities. And as a lesson of this crisis, it gave us 8 new principles. And 2 of those principles are related specifically to independence and surveillance of external auditors. And those who have accounting standards and audit, which we had at one principle, IOSCO separated this in 2 to give greater importance to each one of the standards, or each set of standards. And we saw this change internationally in June 2010, and now comes the history. That was the beginning, and now let's bring it to Costa Rica's context. And here I'll share some of the sins in Costa Rican regulation, and as lessons learned, or if a country is in that journey. What would happen while the world was changing and adopting new standards, new principles, because of the lessons of this crisis? So what did we decide to do in our country? Well, we adopted the NIFS as standard for accounting records in the country, but we also decided 2 things that over time were very expensive. We decided to take NIFs and anchor them in a moment of the year. We adopted NIFs for the financial sector version 2011, and those were static at that time. And the second sin was even adopting those standards for certain provisions. We also defined a different accounting treatment, what we called a gap with NIFs, or divergence. And then in 2011, because of prudential matters, we had a recent crisis. At that moment, the Costa Rican financial system felt sound because we weren't affected as other markets. So we considered that the prudential standards we had back then were robust, and it was good to maintain those. But we established an accounting standard at that moment in time. All the learning in the world, all the new versions of NIFs that were adopted, we renounced to adopting those. And as the years went by, that gap for us became more evident and broader. And what did this generate? Well, it generated some assessments made by World Bank. I remember Rosk assessment in 2012 where it warned the first issues, and then Costa Rica in 2015 started accession process to OECD, and it was more evident that we continue with the financial issues. And what did this unravel? Well, regulatory management decisions and because of these mistakes and to take better measures. In 2017, the Supervision Council that brings together all 4 superintendents decided as a regulatory policy, we'll adopt NIFs, but now we'll do it correctly. Full NIF, as we called it, with the automatic option of any new NIFs and IASP, as they issue new standards, incorporate these in the country, as what happens for the non-financial, non-regulated sector, and because of the accountant schools. And that's the decision we made in 2017. And you will understand that compared to 2011, we had several years of setback with the important gap. All the improvements in NIF 9 that we just mentioned, expected loss and the business model, investment portfolio, we didn't have all that in our regulation, and we had to include those. So we started a process, which was the hardest and publicly, which was a socialization, and that was in 2018, and designing the new regulation we wanted. And unfortunately, although it was a very ambitious expectation, we must recognize that we encountered a very big challenge. And this caused, well, that now we have a new regulation that starts in January 1st, 2020, when we try to close most of the gaps regarding NIFs that were current internationally. Well, I'm very humble. We have to recognize that the effects they had in information systems and financial indicators and in equity adequacy, which is part of our regulatory, there were impacts in these cases. At this moment, in Costa Rica, we have a new standard that will be in effect starting next year, but still prevail in our regulation 8 gaps, well identified, very clear. And as far as our authorities, the development we currently have requires an action plan to close these gaps. And gaps about what? Well, gaps that in discussions of designing these plans 2017-2018 with the implementation in 2020, one of these, which is the most difficult to adopt with the new international provisions, is related to expected credit loss for bank loan portfolio. I think this is one that has the greatest impact. As a matter of fact, our roadmap implies that this gap will take 1 or 2 years longer to develop the policies to close that gap. And what does that imply? Well, adopt NIFs. But we also have to assess which are the impacts in capital adequacy, also establish if there are concerns or risks to mitigate, correct capital requirements, prudential, not touch the economy, but perform prudential regulation and establish an adoption period, a proper adoption period, because these effects, and someone might say, well, these are financial statements, but financial statements per se are important. This information used by public for decision making, and it also has effects in the behavior of participants. It has effect in how banks define their lending policy. So it has real effect in the economy. Therefore, changes have to be measured, well thought out, and well planned over time. And to summarize, and to not take more time, and leave more time for Alfreda. Any questions? Part of the lessons we had during this period were interesting. First, recognize mistakes. International Financial Information Standards is a global standard of high acceptance. We shouldn't be separate to these, and we decided to separate, and that generated us, and is generating problems. Second, the financial sector has multiple players. There's pensions, insurance, exchanges, investment fund managers, and once implementing a full standard generates friction in different fronts, and that has to be discussed with each front. For instance, in insurance, and the new NIF for 2021 is already generating discussion. And as the colleagues said, we have to anticipate this to make the right decisions. A regulatory coherence. We also learned we had high dependency on financial information standards as far as limits and prudential. And what happens when a standard has a new provision, that limit is modified. And we have pressure from the regulated sector to establish or quickly find a new provision that will not affect the limit. But that's where the temptation comes to go and knock on the accounting and try to separate it from NIFs, and that is not correct. What other lesson that we have? Also, there was a discussion in Costa Rica at the end of last year on a new fiscal law, very intense in our Congress, which at the end which produced a new fiscal law. And at some point during the adoption of NIFs to prepare for 2020, the fiscal discussion took high importance in all different forums. And this generated, of course, confusion in the messages we gave the public. Some players wanted for the financial regulator to establish provisions in accounting which had effects on taxes. But we're talking about different worlds. The financial regulator was focused on prudential standards. The accounting should be done according to an international standard and be audited by professionals that follow international standards. And fiscal provisions is the third topic, which has to be separate from the previous discussions, which has to be also covered, but in the proper forums. Part of the discussion last month is that these three conversations are being mixed, and we have to separate these and assign the responsibility in the proper forums. These are the lessons learned and also the sins we have made in Costa Rica, and we want to share that with you. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. And now let's look at the perspective of someone who is an accountant, who advises the government and companies, but also teaches standards. And Peru was one of the first countries that adopted NIFs or NICs back then in Latin America. So Alfredo, what's your perspective? We don't have a lot of time, and I have a few questions. I would like people to also make their questions. So in 5 minutes, Alfredo, can you share your vision of the last 10 years? Thank you, Andre, and colleagues, to everyone for assisting. I have less time because of the excess time they used, but that's fine. You have noticed this morning, and this is the way it happens traditionally with the Crecer events, and I believe that's the way it should be. I haven't been in all these, but I've been in 4. You might have noticed that public accountants start the workday receiving the economic panorama. Always we're explained of what's happening. Today, there was a bias because of the nature of what the organizers wanted for this specific event in Costa Rica as far as public-private partnerships. But you can notice that they gave us an economic perspective. And just this way of organizing an accountant's event shows that accounting doesn't have life in its own or by itself. It doesn't have its own life. Accounting, and that's what we say, and we say it as far as standards, accounting represents economic facts, represents estimates. Therefore, our representation will be valid as long as we don't change that economic reality. And based on this NIFs, accounting, and I'll continue insisting, is here to stay. In my opinion, it's had significant progress in latter years, and I'll separate a little from the financial sector, and I want to go back to the business model that is incorporated in NIF 9 for some of my examples. Notice this, we went from historical cost accounting that I learned in college and I taught my students, and we passed to accounting that is symbol of cash. The reasonable value is if this was cash, how much would it be? This great advance now seems to be complemented with what is happening with NIF 16. So we're at an accounting that is similar to cash. So what do we need to solve as accountants? How do we define then earning was performed or that an earning was not did not happen? We just have prescriptions to say the effects of this is equity or the effects of that are results, but we don't distinguish conceptually that the concepts will allow us to continue developing this model, and we don't define a non-performed profit to a performed revenue. What happens associated to this concept? What happens with the new NIF 16? With this new NIF 16, and I'm sure you read it, and I'm sure you saw that the biggest changes are from the with the operational leasings, and now we should recognize an asset for the right of use and a liability for all the future leasing that reasonably we cannot prevent. If today I have a contract for an operational lease, 3 years, and the underlying is an important amount, I'm going to have to record a liability with current value. And you can see that we left out the definition of liability because NIC 1 complements the definition of the conceptual framework, and it says there's a transaction revenue when the conditions are complied in that conceptual framework to acknowledge an element. So now we have to acknowledge liability, a provision type, which is current value, and for all the future leasings. So the question is, should I today, the leasings that I will use in the future, do I owe that compared to, do I today have the commitment, the future commitment for those leasings? And here comes a second line that I think will be an object of reflection and standards. How do we sustain, for conclusions, the existence of that liability? And now we're saying that we're adopting a perspective of real leverage of companies. There are some companies that will take from one to buy assets. There are companies that won't take debt and will lease. So we're no longer in a reasonable value. We're in a matter of anticipating future obligations, which are measured at a discounted level, which is a symbol of reasonable value. And this is the first thing I notice. And it gets complicated when I try to share this with my students. The second thing I notice in the standards, very positive, is you'll see that now we have standards with more guides. You'll recall that when Peru was adopting the standards many years ago, I don't recall the IFAC president's name, the JUSB. And the JUSB stated that standards shouldn't contain rules. I don't know if you recall that discussion, but now we have more rules in the standards. And why do we have more rules in the standards? Well, because we're missing some core things to round out our science and make it equal to other regulatory science that we have very close to us that has influence in our work, which is legal science. We in accounting do not have interpretation methods. However, standards constantly refer me to, for me to apply professional criteria. I'm sure that we have several professors here. I would like to know, how can you explain to your students how professional criteria is applied? Because this is not described in the standards. When we apply professional criteria, and for those of us who are old, I'm the only old one. I don't know if you want to join me with this, being old, you're welcome. But for old people like professional criteria, and we explain this first by experience. But to teach that, I need to explain the concepts and how concepts change. And I want to give you an example of this. You might have realized that the conceptual framework of May 2018, we're in 2018, this conceptual framework is after NIF 15, income. But that conceptual framework gathers concepts that have been developed in standards, which are concepts that are general and that are useful, of course, to advance. And one of these is very interesting in NIF 15 is a control concept. When we see the control concept expanded, and we've done it fine, we're in the exchange, control and exchange, because now we have two types of accruals. One is exchange and the other one is holding. We have both of these in standards. So what have we added to control? Well, now we're saying control supposes economic use of the client. And you'll notice that we didn't have that concept in the past because of standards. And in this, there's been great progress. Now they include the real world. They include the trade substance, which is already in the 18 standard. NIF 15 doesn't change standard 18, but it gives you a number of elements to continue discussing and expanding to be more accurate. Because in Peru, this happens frequently, that if we try to get an opinion from 4 accountants, we'll probably have, in some complex issues, we might have 4 different opinions. And this could be happening in other places. And what are we missing? Once again, interpretation method. NIF 15, the great novelty, and it's beautiful, from my viewpoint, establishes a sequence of 5 phases to define income. And even if the standard doesn't state this 5-phase sequence is that first I define 1, then I define 2, then 3, and then 4, and then 5. So we've had some issues with telecom companies, for instance, that this also served to make some money, by the way, with the new interpretation, the interpretation number 5. So what's the commercial purpose of a telecommunication company that offers Huawei only through Movistar, or that offers Huawei at a price if I buy a certain 1-year contract, or at a lower price if I take a 2-year contract, or even cheaper if I write a 3-year contract? So what's the commercial essence from the operator's perspective, the service provider? Well, they're selling me a telephone, or are they selling me service? NIF 15 in this regard is spectacular. We shouldn't have doubts that they're selling me a service. They're not selling me a phone. Therefore, including Google. Including Google. Thank you very much. So I continue with the example of the Huawei telephone because this is very important. And I have a final point of what, in my opinion, we still have pending at public accountants. We haven't said anything from the regulatory point of view. We haven't said anything regarding corruption. It's unavoidable. I'm Peruvian, and unfortunately, you have learned about Peru's news. I would prefer you hear that we weren't eliminated from the World Cup, or France didn't beat us 1-0. I would have preferred for that to be the news. But unfortunately, in my country, and now I'm speaking as a citizen, and it is a topic of the Paris World Conference, IFAC 96. What have we said regarding corruption? We don't say anything. What does the society need? It needs someone to say, to give confidence for when that financial information comes, to not have any corruption acts. This brings a lot of complications professionally and legal consequences, as I see going forward. But today, legislation in Peru is involving lawyers and accountants to denounce. The current Peru legislation includes, and for some time now, includes officers regarding money laundering. So how far is our responsibility going from the regulatory point of view? And this session is regulatory. So what are we missing? What do we still have to do in that regard? When will we dare to do more? Without a doubt, it's a very perilous field for us. And I might not have the answer for that. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Alfredo. Well, your 5 minutes were a little more cruel, I think there was in those 5 minutes. But Amado, do you want to add something else? Would you like to add something else? I would like to ask you briefly something about the SME NIFs. This is a project that came about, which ended its first phase in July 2009, right in the crisis. And it's a project, interesting project. It was promoted widely in Brazil. So what can you say in that regard? I know IASB is reviewing the standard. Well, thank you very much. And just to compliment specifically what IASB did to respond to the financial crisis, NIF 9 clearly has more exposure. We did a lot. We reviewed different shares. For instance, in NIF 10, we started using the control concept exactly as in NIF 10. I agree. NIF 15 for 2018, there wasn't great change in control because it provides more elements for assessments, maintaining some aspects which already existed. And in 2018, we also reviewed NIF 7, reviewing the risk assessment, and this was very important. And in NIF 13, which was a consolidation of what we had as far as literature for reasonable measurement. And it's interesting that many English people, when I explained the translation in Spanish of market value, reasonable value, it seems to them it better captures, for many of them, because it's not an absolute value, it's a reasonable value considering the different factors and circumstances in the moment of measurement, and this is very important. But one important element to highlight is that throughout this period and the development of these standards, and you know this, those who have followed IASB's work, everything has been done with great transparency, with public criteria, also interacting with stakeholders, and all this is very important throughout this process, and especially in the banking system, we interacted with the Basel Committee in all phases. So the moment of contributions, we received a lot of inputs from the international financial community. But going directly to your point, and NIF for SMEs was passed in July 2009, and I was just arriving at the IASB, and it was IASB's decision to provide the accounting world a standard specifically that reflects the full NIF but it's not full. It's simplified, it's simple, considering the characteristics of SMEs and the needs of those users. So what we did in the first review of this regulation, IASB decided that it would only include new NIFs that were approved in the period between the addition of the 2009 NIF and its review in 2015 for those standards that were incorporated to the daily practice of the companies. So now we're going to start the second review of SME NIFs. And this review will take into account the need to include the criteria of NIF 9 for financial instruments. There are some important instruments, for instance, classification of financial assets considering cash flow and the business model. It changes the classification of the NIF 39, which is under the intention of the administration. So this is our best interpretation. Then NIF 9 for leasing, and the change between the NIF 6 and 7, acknowledging assets and liabilities. And SME NIFs, in reality, has a very important impact in the financial sector during the crisis, because generally we saw that close to 97% of the companies of existing entities can be classified as SMEs, and medium and micro and individual enterprise, or just individual. But here, this now with my view as a regulator, because I was also involved in the regulations for NIFs, financial NIFs, before being in IASB. And one of the main points of microfinance of SMEs is the access to financial resource, to loans. And to improve the quality of information is one of the main elements to make viable the access to loans to the financial system. So SME NIFs must have correspondence with full NIF, but this correspondence should always take into account the SME's characteristics, therefore simplicity and the importance of a specific regulation for SME, its users, and reflect the economic reality for it to bring benefits as far as access to financial systems and behalf of the owners of the company, and for it also to maintain parity with the full NIF, because many of these SMEs one day will adopt full NIFs, either because they become big or they're subsidiary of another company. So these are very important to maintain this parity, but not to add complexity, unnecessary complexity to SMEs. Thank you, Amado. We have some 15 minutes left, and we hardly spoke about audit standards. And I'll first ask Jorge and then Rodrigo in 1 minute to tell me your experience on the standard 701 on audit statements, key audit matters. What has been the experience in Central America? Be as brief as possible. And if there are any difficulties, we know this is part of the effort to reduce the gap and provide more information on audits. It's considered a very important progress, but I would like to learn about your views as issuers of these as a regulator or overseer. So 1 minute, without a doubt. The new reports provides much better information to the user who we do owe our work to. And that information includes important aspects of the audit, which has been very important in the report. And here is where the professional judgment comes in, of the most important part of the entity, which has to be disclosed in the report, which were the most important things found in the audit. It also includes the ongoing business report. It also includes the auditor's name in charge of this audit and the auditor's opinion, among other things. It has been novelist, this implementation. There wasn't very much turmoil, only in listed companies that are important things were shown in the audit, and it was very conflictive in those listed companies and how these points would be developed, and for it to not have an impact in the media. So they watch very closely the impact in the media when that information is part of their report, because many users read that report to see if it includes any deviation, or so there was much attention paid to this. But I think this is something we overcame, and the companies now are willing, and it's an everyday thing about the standard. So we had to adopt these things, and now they have been adopted. Rodrigo, as a supervisor, a securities supervisor, I can make comments for financial entities as well as listed companies. The new audit report provides more information about the institution or additional developments in this report. And it also provided information on prudential things we had to take account for in the supervision. But the external auditor, as part of the supervision system, would warn. So it would provide some warning signs. And what we saw in Costa Rica was very interesting. There was great expectation and questions regarding what the new report would include. And I could say that we had a very passive attitude. We learned that in the companies there was great discussion between the auditor and the corporate governance or the boards, which was very positive. In other words, for the board to react, to opine, to propose, get upset, and we saw very positive things happen. So with that, we saw that the regulatory purpose was achieved. And we learned the auditors doing their work. Let's review their reports. I think it was very positive, because in corporate governance, that was one of the important points for the board and the corporate governance and all the audit to get involved and engage. And that's when they got the most involved throughout this process as auditors. Thank you very much. Since you mentioned the media, for a board, you can understand it's important to know what's part of a report that's going to be published. But the media in Panama or Costa Rica, has there been any reaction in any report that, although it had the key audit matters because it's information, so it's not only standard language. Has there been anything in the media? There has been a reaction of the media. The users, very specialized users, are the ones who actually look into that information. They are the ones who check the information, but the normal user just goes straight to the numbers and results. Bottom line, they might read it, but they don't understand, or they don't know what it is, and it's a matter of educating the public or training the students in universities for them to know what the purpose is of that opinion, of that new opinion. The same experience for Costa Rica. The media or the journalists still don't understand the wealth of information included in these reports. We do feel there's more education required to that sector for them to convey economic news in a more transparent way. We have a little bit of time, not too much, for a couple of questions from the public. Just A couple. Alfredo, would you like to add anything brief from Peru's perspective of why you're an auditor? While we listen to Alfredo, please prepare a couple of questions. Sorry, not using a microphone. Uh, I want to share two things, recent things in my country that have some impact. In 2009, we developed a general accounting plan for corporate because, according to the standards, public or private, the idea is to implement these. And one of the tools that help us implement these is something that will allow me to gather information to be able to report. In 2009, we had an accounting plan which was standardized with international standards at that moment. And in 2019, we produced a version that refers to the standards starting January 1st, 2019. And besides very valuable comments we received in the Regulatory Council and during certain months, there was one very interesting comment going back to what you mentioned regarding SMEs or SME NIFs. One representative said, we don't have an accounting plan for SMEs. Is there going to be a different one from this one, which is a full NIFs, or are we going to use the same one? And this person requested to include some paragraph for reference because one of the purposes with the accounting plan is to include SMEs to come and become formal. So the standards help formalize SMEs, and in Peru we have a high degree of formalization. So in the last version, our national accountant, Oscar Pajuelo, he didn't come, but I'm sure he needed some signature from one of the entities. I'm sure the plan is to be passed these days, but we use only one plan for large, medium, and small enterprise. The other thing I have to share, and these are my last 30 seconds, is one thing is standards, different thing are tax rules. And careful here. When in a country there's scarce resources like in Peru, in our tax law with many gaps regarding when an income is being accrued. What did our tax administration do? Well, they said, let's go and read what the NIFs say. They read it and they started supervising us using NIF 18 or NIC 18 or NIC 11. But when NIF 15 came out, it was the second time and only two occasions, where the application of a law was postponed. NIF 15 was postponed for a year. Well, because the Ministry of Economy, and I was a part of some of these meetings, the Ministry of Economy would say, we're going to collect less. Look at the impact of the accounting standard in our tax system. Now we have, for the first time in our tax law, first time ever, not since I'm alive, first time ever, a definition for legal accrual. Very interesting to share with you. Thank you, Alfredo. I think in the next Crecer, we should dedicate one session to the relationship between accounting and tax. Do you have any estimates or any date estimate for the issuance of a SME NIFs or the new ones? Or do you have any estimate? Do you know when? No, it's about to start. I won't be working in IASPI when this is published, but the review process involves, for SME NIFs, the issuance of a document called RFE, Request for Information, RFI, and after this, there's a study of all the regulations that were issued, also interpretations from the last update. So this is sent to the ISP director as a proposal, as a draft, for it to be reviewed for at least 90 days through 120 days. After this, it has to be discussed by the directory for the final publishing. In my experience, this would take 2 years, but this is going forward. We have time for one question from the public. A very brief comment. No one has a question? So everything was very clear, I assume. Sorry, no mic. The audit report was done on expectation, but was the gap closed? If the disputes between corporate government continues, gap was closed. What do you think will be in 10 years? Amaro, since you're involved in audit matters, well, it's interesting because you need a witch for that. Because remember, I was a bank regulator before going to IASP. In 2007, there was more proof of the crisis in the U.S., but if you go look in the information in the housing market in the U.S. or real estate market, this actually started at the end of the 90s. So for many, there was clear indication that there would be a crisis, but we didn't know when the crisis would come. They imagined that at the first moment when there was the first bailout in the U.S., that would paralyze the crisis. But then Lehman Brothers came about, and there was no action for additional capitalization. So if Lehman does it, they will manage the rest. If we look back, what happened to regulators in the governments, every day they're working 24 hours non-stop to manage the crisis through $700 trillion authorized for this bailout in the U.S. So crises will come. They're unavoidable. This is my view. What accounting does is should provide transparency of the economic instruments and compare them to the established mechanisms. With this transparency, you can imagine that the information would be of quality, and considering the corporate government structure that includes the various committees of a company and the audit's role, but we can't forget the role of the regulators, supervisors, the role of regulators under a market discipline. So one person alone is not responsible for the crisis. So all this working correctly, and it will make the effect of crisis not as intense compared to the previous crisis. But we don't know this, when and what will be the effect. Thank you very much. I think this is a question for a next Crecer session, to dedicate a whole session to this. So thank you very much. I won't summarize. There's been many changes, very valuable, answering to the demand of the international community to improve standards. And besides the report, there's been a guide, but there's some changes that will come. The ethics code, and then corruption, and the profession, professors and the regulators have been trained and adjusted for this, but we'll see that in our next visit. We'll have better basis to assess this 10-year work. But in the meantime, I would like for us to give a round of applause to our presenters, thanking them. Thank you. Now we'll have coffee, and you can speak with the presenters. Thank you.